In this video, I'd like to introduce you to the ancient worldview. And by this, I mean we'll go back and look at the very earliest origins of religion. We won't worry about denominations or exact teachings or anything, but just what is it we know from the earliest of times across all cultures and different types of religions that we've come to know. What is the ancient thinking of where we came from? Why are we here? What happens when my heart stops beating? And how then is all of this put together in a construct? The first thing we notice about religions is the presiding question over them all, and that is, in the beginning, did God create humanity? Or in the beginning, did humanity create a God? Because the earliest records we have of all anthropologies is that Homo sapiens, human beings, were distinguished as Homo religiosio. That is, all human beings have, as far as we know, asked the question, how did I come to be? Where am I going? What happens when this heart stops beating, and how is this all constructed? We seem to be the only creatures on Earth that have wondered about that, such that we've codified it and made what we call religions to explain it all. But we get ahead of ourselves. From the very beginning, human beings saw and felt that the whole earth pulsated with something supernatural, and that something beyond ourselves must have brought it into being. It's interesting then that we can see common traits amongst all religions. Like I said, this sense of divinity, in the Latin, a sensus divinitatis, that human beings, all cultures have said, why are we here? Who are we? Who made us? How did we get here? That sense of the divine. Secondly, it's interesting that all religions share some sort of common story of a universal disaster. A flood, a famine, a son that went out to sea and got lost. Some sort of catastrophe is common to all religions. So a sense of God, some sort of story of catastrophe. Third, all religions, ancient now, share some sort of story about lostness and foundness. That son who went out to sea and thought was lost came back. That a sense of something not right being made right. And then the other interesting thing about all religions from the ancient antiquities is they all talk about their divinity by what it is not. There's a word for this phenomenon. It's called apopheticism. Literally, they're apophonos, without a voice. Because the idea was, if I can describe my God by what it, she, he, it is, then I've defined them. And if I can define a God, they're no longer a God, because God, by definition, is something outside of us that I can't define. So the way around that philosophical problem was then to talk about God by what it was not. So if I'm visible, God is invisible. If I'm mortal, God must be immortal. If I'm fully knowable, then God is unknowable. Okay? So all religions share this idea of apopheticism, talking about what their God is not. Then we know that as we move on, there's an idea that comes in of monotheism, one God. And they saw the sun being sort of representative, a fascination with God as the sun as a God. Because look, the sun floated in the sky, the sun was always there, the sun comes up every morning, the sun gives us light and heat, and I noticed something else. If I plant corn seed inside my cave, it won't grow. If I plant a corn seed outside my cave, where the sun's light can get to it, the sun can also pull life out of the earth. So the sun and the orb becomes a very ancient, universal symbol of almost all religions. It'll be called El to the Hebrews, Ra to the Egyptians, whatever it is, that orb as the sun as a representative of God. But there we are. In the beginning, one God, the Son, monotheism. Now, the ancients then, how they saw the world. What's the construct? Well, that ineffable, unknowing, apophetic God, El, the orb, is always over here and impersonal. And the ancients saw, we'll go to the Hebrew scriptures, for example, when the Hebrew writers in Genesis 1 says, in the beginning God created a firmament. It's a strange word. Well, in the Hebrew, the word there is really rak, R-A-Q, to transliterate the Hebrew. It literally translates, in the beginning God created a great bowl, a great big dome. If you've ever been out on a camping trip away from city lights and you've seen the stars that go all the way to the horizon and it kind of makes this canopy over you, you can see why they thought we're living under a huge bowl. Or think of the movie The Truman Show. Inside that bowl then, underneath, was the land, the earth, the Eretz, with 4 cardinal directions, north, east, west, and south. And the dome and the earth is held up by pillars, the pillars of the earth. And underneath the square earth and on its side was water, the seas. Incidentally, in ancient literature, water is always death, always. Because to the ancients, you could drown in water. There were creatures out there that were bigger than your boat. It was cold. It was dark. When I planted my crops in the spring, if it got covered with water, they wouldn't grow. Water was death. Remember back to your middle school maps when the teacher would pull down the maps of how these parchment-looking maps of the world before it was complete as we know it today. What was always pictured in the water? Always. Monsters, leviathans, dragons, fork-tailed creatures, evil death, water. Okay, so we have a dome, the land, water, God outside, and then they saw that above the dome were different storehouses. Water, snow, hail, ice. And what happened, for example, when it rained, is that God would say to the water storehouse, open your doors. The water would hit that dome, but there were little pinpricks in it, and the water would go through those pinpricks and come down to us as rain. And by the way, those pinpricks you see are at night what we call stars, because the ineffable one's light shines at night through those little pinpricks. That's what we're seeing. Now, inside the dome during the day was the sun, pulled around by a chariot is what they thought, doing this circuitous orbit. And when the sun's rays were on top of you, that was day. But opposite of it was the lesser light, the moon, that would go counterclockwise with the sun. So we had great light during the day and lesser light, the moon, at night. A quick aside here that I love to tell about the English language. So the ancient reasoned that just like the sun, too much exposure to it is not healthy. It burns my skin, it makes me go dry, it makes me go crazy. So they reasoned by inference and the same theory that then too much exposure to lunar light could also make me a lunatic. And that's where we get that story then of a werewolf and crazy bad things happening with too much exposure to the moonlight, the lunar light. That is exactly the same. It comes from the thinking of just like there's too much great light exposure. Okay, if I've gone too fast, I've included with this module a very cryptic drawing of everything I've helped you talk through, and maybe that would help visual learners. But one more thing now. So monotheism, one God, he's way out there. Remember, it's not the sun that's in the dome. It's the ineffable, the great unmoved mover, the inexpressible one, okay? Now, inside the dome, as history progresses, because the great ineffable one is impersonal outside of the dome, now religions construct lesser spirits inside the dome, and they're personified as helper spirits. Good ones that you might have come to know as angels, and bad spirits of the age that you might come to know as the devil or his minions, doing bad things, but they're inside the dome and they're kind of considered helper gods. So now we roll, you see, into polytheism, the idea of many different gods, and they're personified. They're given names. They have a certain dominion that they're in charge of. For example, Thor throws down lightning bolts or whatever, god of thunder. There were fertility gods that I would incant inside the dome if we wanted to have kids. If I went on a hunt, there was another helper spirit god that I would incant. They became innumerable, and they were near and immediately present, and they could be incanted or summoned. They stood in that gulf between humanity and the divinity outside the dome. But these unseen forces, you see, are now personified. And by participating in the life of these gods, we humans could make sense of life, and we could become wholly and completely human as we lived out our callings on this earth. And now a quick transition to the next lecture on a man with three names that history will come to know either as Av, Abram, or Abraham. We'll explain that wondrous name in the next lecture, but what you need to know now is that Abraham, I'll call him now Abraham, will come to be the founding father of the world's three largest monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He's quite a main player in the landscape of religion. So we'll go to his story first. But he would have grown up with a worldview that I just described. Av was from Ur, a Sumerian, but the Amorites had captured Samaria and made Babylon their capital city. We know from antiquity, by the way, that the city of Babylon that Av or Abram would have known was incredible. It was said that the walls were so wide that a chariot pulled by 7 horses could do a U-turn on the top of its walls. And the king of Babylon loved blue, the color blue. And so he had these huge walls studded with tiny little blue mosaics. We continue to discover them in archaeological digs. If you can imagine this huge wall in the desert sunshine, it was quite a wonder. But then Assyria captures Babylon, and then they built the ziggurats, the hanging gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. In the middle of a desert, just a living wall of green. Wealth. So Av will come from this region that today we would call Chaldea, and the Hebrew scriptures say that. If any of you have Chaldean friends, they can tell you exactly where it is on the map, because that's where Chaldeans come from, modern day, that area between the Tigris and Euphrates. And that's where the story of Abram will start. It's a story, can you imagine, over 4,000 years old. It's astonishing. And in the next lecture, because I'm sharing that lecture with other classes, if you haven't had my lecture yet on the beginning of Genesis, I'll use a couple terms in there that you should know right here to make it more clear. I'll mention the word Toledoth. That's a fancy word that I introduced in a Genesis lecture. It's a Hebrew word. It simply means this is the account of. And in the Hebrew book of Genesis, there's an introduction that's quite grand, and then 10 Toledoths, or 10 stories. The story of Adam and Eve, the story of Cain and Abel, the story of Noah, and then the middle story, the middle Toledoth, is the story of Abraham. It's an amazing story, as I'll show in the next lecture. But to review for today, what I want you to do is to look at that drawing of how the ancients saw the world. Remember that at the very beginning, all religions had a lot in common, more united them than divided them. They all had a belief in one monotheistic God that was outside, impersonal, but yet did it all. Typically symbolized as a circle, eternity, given different names. Then that great one created the dome, the land, the storehouses, the stars, the water, the foundation of the earth. They put that all together. Then trapped inside the bowl or the dome with us are lesser gods that were personified. They all had a task. They all had their specialty of dominions, and they were all named. So slowly religions moved to polytheism. From that construct, we are privileged to have an ancient story that's over 4,000 years old of an incredible guy that you'll hear in the next lecture who will be the founding father of the world's 3 largest monotheistic religions. More about that in our next lecture. Enjoy the picture and the review of that, of how they saw the world. Remember terms like sensus divinitatis, Homo sapiens were Homo religiosio, that we all share ancient stories of creation, lostness, a universal catastrophic event. And from that now, as history moves on, we'll move into all different expressions and particulars. That's where we're headed now. First, the story of Abraham, the founding of Judaism. And I will see you in that next lecture.